The moment you read this title, something subtle tightened inside you. Not curiosity, not excitement, a quiet recognition, the kind that doesn't ask questions but lingers, because it touches a feeling you've carried for a long time without naming. You've known what it feels like to be noticed without being understood, to sense attention that isn't admiration, but observation. Throughout your life, people have watched you more than they've listened to you. Not openly, not deliberately, in pauses, in glances, in the way questions were framed differently around you. You weren't asked what you believed as much as how you process. Not what you felt, but how quickly you stabilized after feeling it. This wasn't accidental. People instinctively observe what doesn't react the way it's supposed to. You've always responded to pressure differently. Stress didn't fracture you. Conflict didn't hijack your identity. Emotional intensity passed through you without leaving permanent residue. You still felt deeply, but you recovered quickly. You recalibrated instead of escalating. Where others became reactive, you became precise. That precision made you difficult to predict, and impossible to fully categorize. This is why some people felt calm around you, while others felt unsettled. You didn't mirror emotions automatically. You didn't amplify chaos. You didn't feed urgency just because it was present. You listened without absorbing. You spoke without inflaming. You stayed present without surrendering your internal position. To systems built on emotional leverage, this is an anomaly. The idea of a doctor wanting to study you is symbolic. It represents the impulse to analyze what behaves outside expected models. In any structured system, medical, psychological, institutional, what doesn't follow averages becomes interesting. Not because it's superior, but because it challenges assumptions. Your nervous system, your perception, your timing didn't align with the standard curve. You may remember moments when authority figures focused on you longer than necessary. Silence stretched. Questions slowed. The attention wasn't invasive, but it was deliberate. They weren't measuring your intelligence or competence. They were measuring your threshold. How you handled ambiguity, how you sat with uncertainty, how you responded when explanations were missing. At times, this attention felt uncomfortable, too probing, too focused. You learned to protect your inner rhythm instinctively. You limited access. You slowed conversations, not out of secrecy, but because you sensed that what made you stable couldn't be reduced to parts without distortion. It wasn't a technique. It was an integration shaped by experience, restraint, and an unusual tolerance for pressure. You may have wished, more than once, to be easier. Easier to explain. Easier to belong. But ease would have required fragmentation. And fragmentation was never something your system accepted. You adapted without losing form. You endured without hardening. You carried intensity without becoming it. This story isn't about being special. It's about being incompatible with simplified models, about why your presence invites examination instead of assumption, and about why this idea doesn't feel dramatic to you now, it feels familiar. Because once you realize you were observed not for what you did, but for how you remained intact, the pattern you've been living starts to make sense. When observation continues without explanation, it changes how you move through the world. You become aware that your reactions are being read, not responded to. That awareness doesn't make you perform, it makes you precise. You begin to notice that the smallest choices you make carry disproportionate weight. A pause instead of a reply. A refusal to rush. A decision to wait when urgency is expected. These moments don't draw attention, but they quietly redirect outcomes. You may have sensed this early, even if you couldn't articulate it. Situations would stabilize after you spoke, or after you chose not to. Arguments lost momentum. Panic softened into problem solving. People recalibrated their tone without realizing why. You didn't take credit for this. Often, you barely noticed it happening. But over time, a pattern formed. Your presence reduced volatility. And anything that reduces volatility becomes interesting to systems built on control. This is where the symbolism deepens. Being studied isn't about curiosity, it's about leverage. Systems want to understand what they can't easily influence. Your internal coherence made you resistant to emotional hooks. Fear, praise, urgency, guilt. These tools work on most people. They didn't work reliably on you. You could feel them, recognize them, and still choose differently. That choice, quiet, consistent, made you unpredictable in a way models don't like. You learned to live with this without naming it. You avoided extremes. You didn't chase validation. You didn't escalate to be heard. You let time reveal what noise couldn't. This wasn't detachment. It was restraint. You discovered that restraint protects clarity better than intensity ever could. And clarity, once protected, compounds. There were moments when you questioned yourself, when staying calm felt like weakness, when not reacting felt like missing an opportunity. You watched others advance faster by leaning into urgency, by aligning with the dominant emotional current. You could have done the same. You chose not to. Not out of moral superiority, but because something in you refused to trade coherence for momentum. That refusal shaped your internal architecture. You learned how to hold complexity without collapsing it into simple narrative. You learned how to tolerate ambiguity without filling it with fear. You learned how to remain present without becoming porous. These skills didn't announce themselves as strengths at the time. They felt like waiting, like restraint, like being slightly out of step with the world's tempo. But restraint has consequences. Over time, it turns into reliability. And reliability attracts responsibility. Not the kind that's assigned, but the kind that finds you. People begin to bring you situations that require care. Conversations that can't afford distortion. Decisions that need steadiness more than speed. They don't always know why they choose you. They just sense that you won't amplify what doesn't need amplification. This is how observation quietly turns into trust. Not admiration, trust. And trust changes the stakes. You're no longer being watched to be understood. You're being watched to see if you remain consistent when it matters. That's a different kind of attention. Heavier, quieter, more consequential. As this realization settles, another understanding begins to form. What made you observable wasn't difference alone. It was durability. The ability to stay intact across pressure, time, and uncertainty without needing to announce it. And that durability is about to be tested in a new way, not by intensity, but by invitation. Invitation doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as access. You're included earlier, asked sooner, given context others don't receive. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence changes how situations behave. You don't rush to fill space, and that restraint invites honesty. When people aren't being pulled toward reaction, they reveal more of what's actually happening. You've learned to recognize this moment, the shift where surface explanations fall away and something real begins to speak. This is when you notice how carefully you're being watched now. Not for mistakes, but for consistency. The question isn't whether you're capable. It's whether you remain intact when complexity increases. You've already shown that pressure doesn't destabilize you. Now the environment is curious about something subtler, whether clarity survives proximity, whether access erodes your center or sharpens it. You may feel this as a quiet tension, not fear, responsibility without ceremony. You're aware that what you say or choose not to say has consequences beyond the immediate moment. This doesn't paralyze you. It focuses you. You don't overspeak. You don't overpromise. You let precision do the work urgency once tried to do for you. Precision has patience built into it. There's also a subtle shift in how you relate to authority. You no longer assume it knows more. You no longer assume it knows less. You evaluate it the same way you evaluate everything now, by coherence. Does it hold under scrutiny? Does it invite truth or manage appearance? You're respectful without being impressed. Curious without being compliant. This balance wasn't taught. It emerged after enough experience taught you where trust actually belongs. You might notice that others test you indirectly. They present incomplete information. They delay answers. They introduce ambiguity to see if you panic or posture. You don't. You wait. You ask one clean question instead of 10 defensive ones. You allow silence to do what pressure never could. And in that silence, structures reveal themselves. What's solid remains. What isn't begins to wobble. This is why the idea of being studied feels accurate without being literal. What's being observed isn't your performance. It's your thresholds. How much uncertainty you can hold without filling it. How much responsibility you can carry without tightening. How long you can stay present without needing reassurance. These aren't qualities that can be extracted or replicated. They're outcomes of a particular relationship with time and pressure. You may feel less interested now in being understood quickly. You've seen how quick understanding often comes at the cost of accuracy. You allow people to misunderstand you longer if it means preserving what's real. Over time, those who can meet you without distortion adjust. Those who can't move on. You don't chase either outcome. You let alignment sort itself. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You, and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. As this phase deepens, a quiet confidence forms, not because everything is clear, but because you are. You trust your ability to remain oriented even when conditions change. You trust that you won't abandon coherence for comfort. That trust is what makes the next step possible. Because what comes next isn't observation or invitation. It's placement. And placement changes everything. Placement rarely feels like promotion. It feels like being positioned without ceremony. You find yourself inside situations that matter, not because you asked to be there, but because something required steadiness and you were already standing in the right posture. No announcement, no explanation, just an unspoken understanding that your presence alters how things unfold. You may notice that environments behave differently once you're involved. Not dramatically, subtly. Conversations become more careful. Decisions slow just enough to become accurate. Emotional volatility loses momentum. You don't enforce this. You don't manage it. It happens because your internal coherence creates contrast, and contrast exposes excess without confrontation. This is where the idea of being studied shifts into something else. Observation becomes reliance, not dependence, reference. People begin to check themselves around you, not because you judge them, but because distortion feels obvious in your presence. You don't call it out. You don't correct it publicly. You simply don't participate in it. That refusal is enough to change the temperature of a room. You might feel an unfamiliar weight here. Not pressure, impact. You become aware that your restraint carries consequence. That choosing silence over reaction prevents escalation. That choosing precision over speed preserves options. This awareness doesn't inflate your ego. It disciplines your attention. You become more selective, not because you're guarded, but because you understand how easily coherence can be diluted when it's overextended. There are moments when others try to pull you into old roles. The one who explains. The one who mediates endlessly. The one who absorbs tension to keep things smooth. You feel the pull. You recognize it, and you decline quietly. You no longer trade integrity for harmony. You've learned that false harmony fractures later, and you're not interested in delayed collapse. This is also where your patience becomes visible, not as waiting, but as timing. You move when alignment appears, not when urgency demands action. You've seen what happens when momentum outruns understanding, so you let understanding lead. This doesn't slow progress, it prevents regret. You act less often, but when you do, it holds. The symbolic doctor figure fades further here. What's being examined is no longer your anomaly. It's your durability. Can you remain intact with access? Can you hold influence without tightening? Can you stay clear without becoming distant? These questions aren't asked aloud. They're answered over time through consistency. You may feel less interested now in visibility. You don't need to be seen to know you're effective. Results speak quietly. Stability compounds. You're learning that the most consequential work often happens without applause. That's not humility, it's accuracy. You understand where real leverage lies, and it's not where noise gathers. As placement settles, something else becomes clear. You're no longer being prepared for complexity. You're being trusted within it. That trust isn't given freely. It's earned by remaining coherent when others fragment, by choosing restraint when others escalate, by staying present without absorbing what doesn't belong to you. And with that trust comes a new phase, not louder, not faster, but deeper. A phase where your steadiness is no longer just protective. It becomes functional. Function doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through effect. You begin to notice that when you're involved, outcomes don't just resolve, they hold. Decisions last longer. Agreements fracture less. People don't need constant reinforcement to stay aligned. This isn't because you impose structure. It's because your presence discourages distortion. When exaggeration finds no echo, it collapses on its own. You may feel this shift internally as well. A new economy of energy takes shape. You spend less on managing reactions and more on maintaining accuracy. You no longer carry what isn't yours to carry. Emotional overflow, borrowed urgency, second-hand fear. These pass by without sticking. You've learned the difference between compassion and absorption, and that distinction preserves you. This is where being studied turns into being used. Not exploited, but relied upon. Systems don't copy you, they orient around you. They place you where calibration matters more than control. You're asked to weigh in when timing is sensitive, when precision matters, when escalation would do damage. Often, the request is indirect. A pause, a look, a moment of deference that says, "We need steadiness here." You respond without drama. You don't inflate the moment. You ask one clarifying question instead of 10 protective ones. You leave space where others would fill it with certainty. And in that space, better choices become available. This is not leadership as dominance. It's leadership as containment, holding complexity long enough for truth to surface without being forced. You might also notice that your tolerance for misalignment has decreased. Not out of judgment, but out of respect for integrity. You disengage earlier now. You don't negotiate your center to keep momentum alive. You've seen how small compromises compound into large fractures. So you choose fewer commitments and keep them cleaner. This selectivity isn't narrowing your world, it's strengthening it. There's a quiet confidence here that doesn't depend on outcomes. You trust your process even when results are delayed. You understand that durability beats immediacy. You've watched fast wins decay. You've watched slow clarity endure. This perspective frees you from chasing validation and anchors you in continuity. At times, others may misread this as distance. Let them. Distance can be a form of care when it protects accuracy. Those who can meet you without distortion will feel closer than ever. Those who rely on intensity to connect will drift away. You don't manage either response. You let alignment do the sorting. Function also brings responsibility, but it's lighter than expected. Not because it's small, but because it fit. You're not performing a role, you're occupying a posture you've already earned. You don't need to become someone else to be effective. You need to remain who you are under pressure, and that's something you've proven you can do. As this phase stabilizes, a deeper realization takes hold. What makes you valuable isn't rarity alone. It's reliability. The ability to remain intact across access, influence, and time. That reliability is what environments lean on when stakes rise and spectacle fails. And as reliance increases, the work ahead doesn't ask you to be louder or faster. It asks you to be exact. Exactness changes how you experience responsibility. It no longer feels like pressure from outside. It feels like an internal alignment that quietly refuses distortion. You notice that when something is placed in your hands, your first instinct isn't to act, it's to check fit. Not morally, structurally. Does this decision preserve coherence, or does it demand performance? Does it hold under time, or does it only survive urgency? These questions surface automatically now. You don't dramatize them. You trust them. You may realize that your relationship with influence has matured. Influence no longer feels like something you gain. It feels like something that arrives when stability is present. People sense when you won't exploit ambiguity or rush conclusions for advantage. They sense that you can sit with unfinished information without forcing it into narrative. That capacity makes others more careful, not because they fear you, but because care becomes the natural response to clarity. There's a subtle internal discipline at work here. You speak less, but when you do, your words land with proportion. You're not trying to be memorable. You're trying to be accurate. Accuracy doesn't echo loudly, but it echoes long. You've seen how a single precise statement can prevent weeks of confusion, how one well-timed pause can de-escalate what argument never could. This reinforces your trust in restraint. You may also feel a growing intolerance for false urgency. Not irritation, clarity. You recognize when speed is being used to bypass responsibility, when momentum is masking uncertainty. You don't resist it aggressively. You simply don't comply with it. You slow the process by staying exact. And in that slowing, the truth has room to show itself. What can't survive accuracy reveals itself quickly. This is where the symbolic study truly ends. What once observed you for anomaly now relies on you for calibration. Not because you're exceptional, but because you're consistent. Consistency under access is rare. Many can remain coherent at a distance. Few can do it when information, expectation, and consequence converge. You can. Not perfectly, but reliably. Reliability is what systems lean on when stakes rise. Internally, there's also a shift. You no longer feel the need to protect your center aggressively. You know its boundaries. You sense when something approaches them. You adjust without conflict. This ease doesn't make you passive. It makes you mobile. You can move through complexity without dragging it inside you. You can exit without burning bridges and stay without losing yourself. You might notice inspiration changing shape again. It no longer pushes you toward expansion. It pulls you toward refinement. Fewer commitments, cleaner agreements, deeper focus. You're not interested in being everywhere. You're interested in being exact where you are. This choice increases your impact while reducing friction, a balance that once felt impossible. As this phase continues, one more realization settles in quietly. You were never being prepared for recognition. You were being prepared for precision, for the ability to operate where small misalignments create large consequences, and where steadiness matters more than intensity. The next movement will not ask you to step forward dramatically. It will ask you to remain exact when others begin to lean on what you carry. When others begin to lean on what you carry, the shift is subtle but unmistakable. The room doesn't get quieter because you ask it to. It quiets because noise no longer serves a purpose. You become aware that people are listening not for reassurance, but for orientation. They're checking whether what they feel is grounded or inflated. Your presence doesn't give answers, it gives proportion. And proportion steadies things faster than certainty ever could. You may notice that this reliance doesn't flatter you. It focuses you. You become more intentional with timing, more careful with language, more disciplined with silence. Not because you're afraid of making mistakes, but because you understand impact now. You've seen how one imprecise moment can echo longer than a dozen accurate ones. So you choose accuracy even when it costs immediacy. This is where your internal architecture proves itself. Many people can be coherent in isolation. Fewer can remain coherent when expectations rise and access increases. You can feel that pressure now, not as stress but as density. Information arrives layered. Decisions arrive unfinished. People arrive carrying their projections. You don't absorb any of it fully. You sort. You hold. You return only what's necessary, cleaner than it arrived. The symbolic idea of being studied dissolves completely here. There's nothing left to analyze. What you carry has already demonstrated its function. You don't need to explain why you move slowly or why you resist escalation. Results speak in quieter ways. Fewer fractures, fewer reversals, fewer regrets. Systems don't celebrate this. They depend on it. And dependence is heavier than praise. You may feel a temptation here, to simplify yourself for others, to translate your internal clarity into something easier to digest. You resist it, not stubbornly but wisely. You've learned that clarity loses strength when it's diluted to be palatable. So you let others adjust to your pace rather than adjusting your pace to theirs. This isn't distance, it's integrity. There's also a growing sense of calm authority that doesn't require reinforcement. You don't posture. You don't assert. You remain exact. People begin to trust that if you're present, things won't spin out unnecessarily. That trust changes how responsibility flows. It lands where it fits. And it fits you because you're not performing a role, you're occupying a posture you've earned over time. Internally, you may feel a deepening commitment to staying intact. Not rigid, intact. You allow change without allowing erosion. You adapt without dissolving. This balance didn't come from theory. It came from experience layered patiently over years. You've learned that what survives isn't what resists change, but what can absorb it without losing form. As this phase settles, the work ahead becomes clearer. Not louder, not more visible, clearer. You're being asked to continue doing what you already know how to do. Hold complexity without dramatizing it, move with timing rather than urgency, and remain accurate when others lean. The story isn't accelerating now, it's stabilizing. And stabilization is where real influence begins. Stabilization changes the texture of your days. You're no longer bracing for impact or scanning for threat. You notice how your attention rests more naturally on what matters and releases what doesn't without effort. This isn't numbness. It's selectivity refined by experience. You've learned that clarity is preserved not by guarding everything, but by choosing precisely what deserves to stay close. You may feel a growing confidence in your internal timing. Decisions don't feel rushed or delayed, they feel ready. When something aligns, you move without hesitation. When it doesn't, you don't negotiate with yourself. This reduces friction in ways others can sense even if they can't explain it. Your steadiness creates a rhythm that invites others to slow down, to think, to choose more carefully. Not because you instruct them to, but because your pace makes alternatives visible. There's also a quiet recalibration in how you relate to complexity. Where others simplify too quickly or get overwhelmed, you hold the middle. You allow contradictions to coexist long enough for something more accurate to emerge. This doesn't mean you avoid decisions. It means your decisions are informed by proportion rather than pressure. You've seen how false clarity can do more damage than uncertainty, so you give truth the time it needs to show its shape. People may begin to trust you with moments that carry weight rather than visibility. Transitions, tensions, conversations that can't afford spectacle. You're not asked to fix them. You're asked to be present while they unfold. That presence doesn't absorb what's happening, it steadies it. You don't take on what isn't yours. You hold space without becoming the space. This distinction protects you and the moment at the same time. Internally, you might notice a subtle satisfaction that isn't tied to success. It's the satisfaction of alignment, the feeling that you're no longer betraying your internal signal to keep things moving. You're willing to pause outcomes if it preserves integrity. You're willing to proceed when it's right, even if recognition doesn't follow. This balance frees you from the push and pull that once drained your energy. The symbolic idea of being studied feels distant now, almost irrelevant. What mattered wasn't the attention, it was what survived it. You remained intact when curiosity turned to reliance, when access increased, when expectations rose. You didn't harden. You didn't dissolve. You adjusted. That adaptability, paired with restraint, is what gives your presence its quiet authority. As this phase continues, inspiration becomes steadier and more practical. Not grand visions, but clean impulses that feel trustworthy. You act on them without overthinking because they align with what you've stabilized inside. Action flows from coherence rather than ambition, and because of that, it lasts. What's approaching isn't a test or a reveal. It's a continuation that feels earned. You're not being asked to become something new. You're being asked to remain accurate as the world leans a little more heavily on what you already are. And you're ready for that, not because you're prepared, but because you're aligned. As continuation sets in, you begin to understand something most people never articulate. Stability is contagious. Not in a dramatic way, but in a corrective one. When you remain grounded under pressure, others unconsciously adjust their behavior around you. They become more careful with words, less impulsive with decisions. Not because you demand it, but because excess feels unnecessary in your presence. You don't absorb volatility, and without an echo, it loses momentum. You may notice that expectations around you have changed. People don't ask you to react anymore. They wait. They watch how long you pause, how deliberately you respond. Silence around you has become informative rather than awkward. This is a shift from performance to presence. You're no longer valued for what you produce quickly, but for what you preserve consistently. Internally, there's a deeper trust forming between you and your own judgment. You no longer second-guess the instinct to slow down, to ask one precise question instead of many defensive ones, to let ambiguity sit until it clarifies itself. You've seen enough outcomes now to know that rushing clarity usually distorts it, so you let truth mature. This patience isn't passive, it's active containment. You might feel less tempted to explain yourself than ever before. Not because you've become closed, but because explanation no longer improves understanding. Those who can meet you at your level of precision don't need translation.